actually going to ask our first poll question of the summit right now. Ready, set, go. Which of these emerging technologies are you most excited about? We want to know. A, artificial intelligence. B, Internet of Things. C, augmented reality. Or is it D, quantum computing? Weigh in right now. We'll share those results a little bit later here in our first session. Now, joining me to set the stage for our summit and share what's happening in emerging tech today and tomorrow is Microsoft Chief Storyteller, Steve Clayton. Steve, come on up here. Thanks for being
Chris.
here.
Great to be here.
Helping us kick things off today. Have a seat.
Thank you.
Now, perhaps the best way to look forward is to look in the rear view and talk about the past first. Tell us what's happened in, say, the last few decades in regards to technological innovation. I know that's a lot to cover.
Yeah, it is sometimes useful to look in the rearview mirror. And Microsoft has been around as a company for 40 years. And if I think about those 40 years, they've sort of been punctuated by key changes at certain times that shift the industry, that shift the landscape, sometimes even shift society. So, 40 years ago, we were a pretty small company back then. We started out, building software to help people program computers with BASIC, and then we built the Windows operating system. So there was this move from command line computing to graphical computing. And then we went through sort of the next shift as we started to get networked computing, and that was the forbear to the internet. That created another huge shift in computing. And then obviously over the last few years, we've seen this huge shift towards these two worlds coming together of mobile computing, multiple different devices, shapes, sizes, types, and cloud computing, and those two things coming together. And now I think we're on the cusp of another change around a big trend that we're spending a lot of time talking about inside the company and increasingly outside, and the industry, frankly, is talking about, is this whole shift towards intelligence and artificial intelligence. And that we think is going to have a dramatic change on industries, on society, on how we do business, on how we use technology personally.
Now, we're talking about the last couple of decades, as you said, 40 years. Seems like I've seen everything come to life. Just about everything I use and depend on now was not around when I was a kid. How does Microsoft as a company view innovation? How do you determine what's the next big thing, the next trend? It seems like we've already discovered everything we can possibly discover, but that's not true, of course.
Well, we can always look to the movies for a little bit of inspiration.
Yes, right.
And sometimes they're better at predicting the future than we are.
Sure.
But science fiction sometimes does become science fact. And the way that we approach innovation at Microsoft, it's an interesting word. I think innovation, if you asked most people what does innovation mean, they think it's something new or novel that they've never seen before.
Right.
And it's actually very rare that you see that in our industry, that you see something completely new that's never ever been done before. Many times we're building on top of other people's inventions, either inside the company or outside. But you take something like HoloLens, and that's completely new. Nothing like that has really ever been seen before, mixed reality. But the way that we approach innovation is sort of at two ends of a spectrum. One is to look at how do we do very fast kind of quick twitch, I would call it, innovation. And the cloud has allowed us to do that better. In the past, we used to get the innovation of an update to Windows, for example, would come every 2 years, and it would come on a stack of CDs. And that was pretty slow innovation. But what the cloud and the internet has allowed us to do is to deliver innovation overnight. And for those people who are on things like the Windows Insider program, we can deliver innovation very quickly in existing products. So that's sort of more the quick twitch innovation. But then we also have to balance that with more blue sky innovation, thinking out into the future, trying to create the future, frankly. And you'll hear from some of the leading thinkers there today, from places like Microsoft Research. We have 1,000 PhD level scientists who are literally trying to create the future and have been trying to do that with something like artificial intelligence for the last 25 years. So really it's this balance of how do you sort of look very far over the horizon, but how do you also incubate very quick near-term innovation?
Right. And so let's talk about today. What's going on currently in emerging technology? What are the trends right now?
Yeah, I think there are a number of areas. There are lots of different things going on, but to pick on a few things, I think Internet of Things is a big one. Augmented reality is a big one. Artificial intelligence certainly is a big one. So if I was to pick on those three, the Internet of Things, and in many ways, this sort of world of cloud computing and devices and Internet of Things is what is creating this groundswell around artificial intelligence. So Internet of Things, we now have sensors on all kinds of devices that are generating huge amounts of data, whether that's data on where your PC is currently located because it has a GPS sensor in or an accelerometer in. But there are also sensors out in oil fields that are showing oil companies, what is the level of pressure and temperature in a piece of manufacturing equipment out in Siberia. So there are huge amounts of sensors around the world now generating these huge volumes of data. So Internet of Things rather, is really one of the big trends. Augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality, all of those I think are fascinating topics, and they run the spectrum from being used in the entertainment environment, being used in the gaming environment, using them for fun. But certainly what we're seeing with HoloLens, which we think is a different category. So it's not, there is a lot of terminology around this field of is it mixed reality, augmented reality, or virtual reality. And we think HoloLens does have some unique properties, and we're really starting to see how businesses are using that. So people like, Japan Airlines are using it. People like Lowe's are using it. Lots of different industries looking at how can they use this holographic environment to create this mixed reality world for doing things like, hey, I want to go and service, an aircraft engine. It turns out it's pretty hard to take an aircraft engine off an aircraft, to train people who are going to, go and work on those engines. But you can create a very, very, a great example of that, a sort of digital version of that in a holographic world that you can do things with that you literally can't do in the physical world. So you can, expand out that engine. You can walk inside of the engine. You can teach maintenance on an engine in a way that you simply can't do in the physical world.
Right.
So we're seeing a huge amount of innovation in the way people are approaching things like HoloLens. And then this world of artificial intelligence, I think, is fascinating because it's something that the field of computing has pursued for a very long time. Alan Turing, way back, in the UK and in Manchester, actually, back in the war era, was looking at AI. But what's happened over the last few years is this combination of huge amounts of data that are coming from these sensors, huge amounts of computing capability that's now available on demand in the cloud with things like Azure. And then you combine that with some recent breakthroughs in the technology that we can use to train computers, and you'll hear more about that, I think, later today from some of our researchers. And we are on the cusp, or in fact, we are really starting this huge breakthrough in how machines and technology really start to become much more intelligent and start to really work on our behalf rather than at our command, which is going to be a really big breakthrough, I think.
Now, in regards to HoloLens and AI, obviously we're talking about significant leaps in technology, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But first, I'd like to pay off our poll question because the audience has weighed in as we asked them to do. We're going to present poll questions throughout the summit here today, and we want to be able to reveal the results in real time so you can see what your peers are thinking. So here is that poll question. Which of the emerging technologies are you most excited about? Was it artificial intelligence? B, Internet of Things? Was it augmented reality that we just talked about? Or is it quantum computing? Let's find out what the answer is. According to the majority, it is Internet of Things, as you mentioned there. What's your reaction to that? Definitely the front runner there, almost half the audience.
Yeah, I thought people were going to go for augmented reality, but Internet of Things is, it's one of these topics it's been around for a little while, actually, but I think we're now at the point where people are really starting to see, I think this happens with lots of technologies, Chris, is we spend a little while figuring out what is this thing? What are we going to do with it? And Internet of Things has been around long enough now, and the technology has got to a maturity point that people are really starting to say, well, here's what I can go and do with it. And all of this data that's coming from these multiple different sensors, what can I go and do with them to transform my business? And many of the stories that we've been telling through some of our other events over the last year around companies like ThyssenKrupp or Rolls-Royce or Ecolab, all of these companies, all of those stories that I've been involved in telling, actually, they're all really built on the basis of an Internet of Things solution.
Right. Obviously, we mentioned Internet of Things. We talked about AI, and we're going to talk about a whole lot here today. But it often does come down to, as you said, innovation isn't necessarily the newest. It's the newest way to maybe use some things that already exist, technology that's around. But we are talking about significant leaps in technology. Can you give me some examples of breakthroughs that have essentially enabled this latest round of
So let me give you an example. One of the breakthroughs that I saw a couple of years ago, which comes back to this idea of data and machine learning, being able to train systems, is about 5 years ago. We showed an example, a very raw example in Beijing. We showed it at a university of a technology that would allow you to speak in your language and have it translated in real time into a different language. In that case, it was Chinese, and you could see the glimpse of this Star Trek-esque
Sure.
translation technology, and many people thought that was impossible. And then a few years on, we started to demonstrate that in terms of an actual product. So we had Skype Translator, and 2 years ago, we demonstrated that on stage. The only real reason that became possible is because of this field of, there's a technology called deep neural networking that really is a breakthrough over the last couple of years around how can we build a model in computing to help computers begin to understand things like speech and things like vision in the same way that humans do. And so that was a real breakthrough that up until then, we had some fairly, I would say, brittle examples of this translation technology, but almost overnight, this breakthrough in this field of deep neural networking, and then a huge amount of data that you can plug into this training model for the system, allowed the system to really start to understand language in a very, very profound way from a human point of view. We've done the same thing with vision. And so we've got models now where you can train a computer to see and recognize the real world just as we can. So it would look around this room and say, well, that's a chair, and that's a table, and that's a bottle of water. Something we take for granted, but you can now have a computer with a pretty high level of accuracy, do that same thing.
Wow.
So you start to think about, well, where can I apply these things? Well, take, for example, that vision technology. And now you put that on the front of an autonomous vehicle. There's lots of talk around autonomous self-driving vehicles. You and I, when we're driving a vehicle, we know the difference between a ball bouncing across the street and a young child running across the street, I should say. You put a camera on the front of a car and it can start to do the same thing. It can start to recognize the real world in the same way that we do. We start to take some of that speech and language technology and you see it come to life in things like Cortana. So now I can start to do, talk to my computer, whether it's from across the room or whether it's sat out my computer and have it do tasks for me. Other things that we're starting to see is that computers can begin to recognize and understand and anticipate what it is we're trying to do because they can spot patterns. So a recent technology that we added into Windows 10 that's based on this artificial intelligence and machine learning is it can look at my email if I give it permission to, and it can say, oh, you've just made a commitment to Chris. So I could say, hey, Chris, let's go for a beer this evening after we've finished up here. And my Cortana can recognize that I've just made a commitment to you because it recognizes a string of text.
Yeah.
And then it will say, hey, Steve, do you want me to put that into your schedule to make sure that you do go and do that and remind you to do that? So we're just starting to see these very subtle but powerful ways that technology, through understanding language, through understanding environment, through vision, is really starting to be much more of a helper. Up until now, over the last 40 years, we've driven technology. We've had to drive technology to do what we want. And now we're on the cusp of technology starting to understand our world and beginning to do things on our behalf with our permission.
As exciting as that is, Steve, you realize that if you make my email that smart, I'm going to run out of excuses. I mean, I can no longer say I missed the email or I'm sorry, it was not on my calendar.
I'll make sure that we add a special algorithm for you, Chris, that it doesn't recognize the commitments we make to each other.
Thank you, I appreciate it. So as a storyteller, this is right up your alley. I mean, what promise do these technologies hold? It's one thing to have the latest and greatest and, ooh, hey, I can talk to this thing and it does it back. But we're at the forefront here of some really powerful things, right?
I think the promise it holds, I see it on multiple levels. One is on a personal level. Quite simply, it's going to make me more efficient, make me better at my job, make me better at just being on time, just simple stuff.
Right.
Then at a business level, I think some of these technologies, things like Internet of Things, things like artificial intelligence, they sort of hold the key to having profound changes on how businesses operate. Some of the stories we've told over the last year. ThyssenKrupp, the elevator company, for years they've been an elevator company. Now they've transformed themselves largely, not largely, but into a different company. They're also now a software company. They provide software services to remotely maintain elevators, both their own elevators and other people's elevators. So it's changing businesses. And then on a more global scale, I think these technologies have the potential to impact society. If I think about my family, some of my family back in the UK, they're Chinese. Turns out I don't speak Chinese and they don't speak English. But now I have this piece of technology called Skype Translator that lets me have a conversation with my family that I've known my wife's family for 25 years, but I've never been able to have a natural language conversation with them, and nor have my kids. They haven't been able to speak to their family. So I see technology having these sort of personal changes on how I just, how I am more effective. Business changes on digital technology will transform businesses, and then these more societal level impacts. I think all of those things are going to be impacted by things like artificial intelligence and Internet of Things.
Well, this has been a wonderful way to kick off the summit here. We appreciate all your time. We didn't even get to the invisible revolution, but if I were to ask you real quickly, context of emerging technology, invisible revolution, you would say?
The invisible revolution, to put it succinctly, is lots of the technologies that you will see that will transform our world over the next few years will be things that are invisible.
Right.
For the last 10 years, there have been things that you physically can hold, devices in many ways.
Right.
And they will continue to evolve, but I think the real magic is starting to come to life in the software that sits inside of those things, and that's the invisible revolution.
That's great. Steve, thank you. Thanks for
It's a
joining
pleasure.
us. We
Pleasure to
appreciate
see
it.
you,
All
Chris.
right, thank you.
Thank
You
you so
too.
much.